The Galactic Crisis. The galaxy was in turmoil. The Galactic Council, the most powerful political body in the entire universe, was in crisis. For centuries, the Council had held the galaxy together. Different alien species, each with their own unique abilities and strengths, had formed a delicate balance of power. But now something was shifting, and it was humanity, Earth's Deathworlders, who were causing it. The council members sat in their massive meeting chamber, looking at the holographic screens in front of them. The room, usually filled with the hum of calm conversation and the exchange of diplomatic pleasantries, was now silent. Tension filled the air, thick enough to cut through with a knife. The council had expected their unity, their overwhelming numbers, to crush humanity. They had been warned that Earth's people were resourceful, but no one had prepared for this. The Deathworlders, humanity, had been quietly preparing for war, building their fleets in secret, honing their deadly tactics, and studying the ways of the galaxy's other species. And now they were showing just how dangerous they were. For the first time in their existence, the Galactic Council felt powerless. Across the galaxy, their ships were falling one by one. The humans didn't fight like the other species. They didn't rely on overwhelming force or superior technology. No, humanity had something else, an unpredictable, savage strategy that threw their enemies off balance at every turn. The first sign of the new threat came quietly, almost unnoticed. A small fleet of human ships had entered Council-controlled space. The Council assumed they would be easily destroyed. Earth's fleet was smaller compared to the powerful armadas of the Galactic Council, but instead of retreating or fighting like any other species would have, humanity's fleet attacked in a way no one expected. The Council's ships were ambushed in the darkness of space, in asteroid fields where their advanced sensors couldn't reach. Humanity's ships used the debris as shields, emerging from hidden places to strike deadly blows. The humans were ruthless, every ship moving with purpose, every attack hitting with terrifying precision. The first battle was a disaster for the Galactic Council. The enemy wasn't some primitive race or underdeveloped species they could easily crush. No, these were Deathworlders, creatures who had lived in hostile environments, adapted to impossible odds, and learned how to fight in ways that no one had anticipated. It wasn't just that the humans fought harder. They fought smarter. The tactics they employed were unlike anything the Council had ever seen. The human fleet didn't rely on numbers or brute strength. Instead, they used their surroundings. They'd fought like shadows, moving and striking in ways that confused the Council's best commanders. At first, the Council thought it was just a fluke. Perhaps the humans were lucky, or maybe their fleet had been caught off guard. But it wasn't long before the truth became clear. Earth's Deathworlders had outplayed them at every turn. The humans were using tactics the Council had never considered. They were unpredictable, fast, and completely outside the rules that the Council had lived by for centuries. And this was only the beginning. The panic spread across the galaxy. Reports came in from every corner of the known universe. Ships that had ventured into human space never returned. Fleet after fleet had been wiped out, and no one could figure out how. The Galactic Council, once the pinnacle of power and influence, found themselves in the impossible position of having no answers, no strategy, and no way to stop the humans. The Council scrambled for solutions, calling in their greatest minds and strategists. Meetings were held, but no one could understand what was happening. Human tactics weren't just unusual, they were alien. The Council's military leaders felt their sense of control slipping away, and panic began to settle in. But no one was more terrified than the Council's leaders. They had always considered themselves the dominant force in the galaxy, the ones who set the rules. And yet, here was a species, humanity, that had completely shattered their worldview. The tables had turned. The Deathworlders were not just a nuisance. They were a threat unlike any the galaxy had seen before. And still, they couldn't understand why the humans fought like this. Why didn't they follow the rules? Why didn't they just give up? The humans, it seemed, had a completely different mindset. They fought not just for survival, but for victory, with an unrelenting ferocity that sent shockwaves throughout the galaxy. The Council could no longer deny it. Humanity was winning. As they scrambled to organize their forces, something unexpected happened. The humans didn't just fight in one place. They were everywhere. It wasn't just the space battles that were unsettling. The Deathworlders were attacking supply lines, sabotaging resources, and hitting strategic locations with terrifying speed. And still, the Council struggled to keep up. The galaxy was on the edge of a precipice, and no one knew how far the fall would be. The Council knew one thing for sure. The Deathworlders had only just begun, and humanity's war for the galaxy had only just begun to unfold. The Galactic Council was in chaos. It wasn't just their fleets being destroyed that terrified them. It was the realization that humanity was not only capable of outthinking them, but was also growing stronger with every encounter. The Deathworlders were adapting quickly, learning from every skirmish and turning each failure into a new strategy. The Council's generals, once regarded as the galaxy's best tacticians, found themselves struggling to keep up. In their meeting chambers, panic had set in. The holographic displays around the room flickered with reports of battles lost and assets destroyed. The Council had always prided itself on its advanced technology, its overwhelming numbers, and its ability to predict the moves of any enemy. But none of that seemed to matter when facing the Deathworlders. The humans' tactics were unlike anything the Council had ever encountered. Their ships moved with a fluid, unpredictable grace, using their environment in ways no other fleet could. Asteroids, debris fields, even the radiation from dying stars, all of it became a weapon in the hands of humanity's fleet. Their knowledge of space was not just scientific. It was born of centuries of survival in one of the most dangerous environments in the galaxy, Earth itself. The humans had evolved on a planet full of deadly predators, harsh climates, and constant threats to survival. They had learned to fight not just to survive, but to win. And now those instincts were being applied to the galaxy at large. The Council had thought themselves invincible, but the Deathworlders had shattered that illusion. Every battle seemed to have the same result. The humans would appear out of nowhere, strike swiftly, and disappear before the Council could react. And when they did engage, the Deathworlders didn't fight fair. They used psychological warfare, cunning traps, and guerrilla tactics that the Council's standard strategies couldn't counter. One of the most shocking moments came when the humans ambushed a fleet of Council ships in a seemingly ordinary asteroid belt. What the Council didn't realize was that the humans had placed explosive charges in the surrounding asteroids, rigging the entire field to explode at the right moment. As the battle began, the humans lured the fleet into the trap, detonating the charges and causing a massive chain reaction. The destruction was catastrophic. But the humans weren't just ruthless in battle. They understood the importance of fear, of keeping their enemies off balance. The Deathworlders knew how to strike terror into the hearts of the Council's soldiers. They would attack without warning, leaving no trace of their presence, and then disappear as quickly as they had come. No one knew where they would strike next, and that unpredictability made the Council's leaders paranoid. On the front lines, the Galactic Council's soldiers had begun to question their leaders' abilities. The human fleet seemed to know their every move, anticipating their strategies before they were even fully formed. The soldiers of the Galactic Council were trained to fight with precision and order, but the Deathworlders didn't follow those rules. They broke them. They used their surroundings, their creativity, and their unyielding will to fight in ways that made the Council's soldiers look slow and predictable. One of the highest-ranking officers in the Galactic Council, General Therath, had always been a staunch believer in the superiority of his fleet. He had fought in countless campaigns, and his victories were legendary. But now his pride was crumbling. The humans had bested him time and again. His fleet was decimated after a series of surprise attacks. At first, he thought it was bad luck. But as the Deathworlders struck again and again, he realized that there was no luck involved. The humans were simply better at war. Desperation began to creep into the Council's chambers. The strategies they had relied on for millennia no longer worked. Ships that were once considered invincible were being torn apart. The humans seemed to have an answer for everything. They had found the one weakness the Galactic Council had never expected: their unpredictability. Humanity fought not with the strength of numbers, but with the strength of its mind, its will, and its willingness to break all the rules of war. Meanwhile, the Deathworlders continued to push forward, taking advantage of the chaos and fear they had caused. With every victory, they gained more confidence, more territory, and more resources. The Galactic Council had no idea how to respond. Their advanced technology, their overwhelming numbers, their fleets that once ruled the galaxy, they were all falling apart in the face of humanity's relentless assault. The tide of war was turning. What had once been considered impossible, humans defeating the most powerful military forces in the galaxy, was now a reality, and the Galactic Council had no idea how to stop it. Their power, their authority, everything they had built was now crumbling under the weight of humanity's savage brilliance. As they sat in their chambers, discussing their next move, one thing was clear: the war had changed, and the Deathworlders were leading the charge. In the heart of the Galactic Council's command center, the mood was dire. The once proud leaders of the galaxy's most powerful coalition were now facing the reality of defeat. For generations, they had maintained an iron grip on the galaxy, but humanity's Deathworlder fleet was swiftly unraveling everything they had worked for. The losses were staggering, and there seemed to be no end in sight. The Council had always been a bastion of order, precision, and control. They prided themselves on their well-oiled strategies and their ability to predict their enemies' every move. But the Deathworlders were different. They didn't follow the rules. They didn't rely on predictable patterns. The humans were chaotic, unpredictable, and above all, relentless. And it was this very unpredictability that was breaking the Council's spirit. For the first time in centuries, the leaders of the Galactic Council found themselves questioning their own military might. Their best fleets, their most skilled commanders, none of it seemed to matter when faced with the brutal cunning of the Deathworlders. As the reports came in, the numbers told a grim story. Entire fleets were being obliterated, their ships shattered by attacks they never saw coming. Among the many council members, one leader stood out. High Commander Kalrith had been a symbol of strength, known for his brutal efficiency and unwavering confidence in his tactics. But now, sitting in the war room surrounded by his fellow leaders, he was a shadow of his former self. The once commanding figure was reduced to a broken man, his face haggard, his eyes sunken from the constant strain of failure. The reports had become a blur of bad news. Deathworlder ambush in Sector Zeta 6, fleet decimated. Another hit-and-run attack in the Lorian Nebula. No survivors. The list seemed endless, and Kalrith felt a weight settle on his shoulders. The enemy they were facing was unlike anything he had prepared for. Humanity didn't fight like anyone else. They didn't care about rules or conventions. They fought with pure survival instinct, honed through centuries of living on a hostile, deadly world. As the commander stared at the glowing map of the galaxy, a new wave of panic spread across the council chambers. The Deathworlder fleet had not just defeated them in battle, they had taken something far more valuable. The morale of the Galactic Council. The soldiers in the field were beginning to panic. The civilian populations of the galaxy, once safely under the Council's control, were now terrified. Rumors of the Deathworlders' ruthless tactics and terrifying efficiency were spreading like wildfire. The Galactic Council's generals were frantic. They had always relied on overwhelming force, technological superiority, and carefully planned strategies to crush any threat. But the Deathworlders didn't care about overwhelming force. They didn't even care about traditional space warfare. They used their ships like weapons of terror, attacking without warning, never giving their enemies a chance to fight back. High Commander Kalrith was meeting with his top generals when a report came in from the front lines. Another fleet had been ambushed in the fractured expanse, an area once considered too dangerous for the Deathworlders to venture into. The report was clear. The fleet had been decimated. The humans had attacked with unparalleled speed, using a mix of sabotage, surprise, and ferocity to dismantle their enemies. There was no explanation for how they managed to slip through the Council's defenses. No one could track them. No one could predict where they would strike next. "How are we losing to them?" Kalreth muttered under his breath, his voice tinged with disbelief. "These are just humans. We have the power to wipe out entire civilizations, and yet we are failing." One of his generals, a younger officer named Vekla, dared to speak. "We underestimated them, Commander. They don't think like we do. They fight like they have nothing to lose, like they've faced death at every turn. And it's made them stronger." Kalreth slammed his fist on the table, the sound echoing through the chamber. "I don't care about their spirit or their survival instinct, Vekla. They are attacking us in ways that no one has ever done before. We must find a way to stop them." But even as he spoke, a cold realization settled over him. The tactics they had relied on for centuries, massive fleets, overwhelming firepower, and careful calculation, were useless against an enemy that didn't follow those rules. The Deathworlders had a different kind of strength, one that couldn't be measured by numbers or firepower. It was the strength of a species that had fought and survived against the most hostile conditions imaginable. And that strength was proving to be their greatest weapon. The council leaders were beginning to panic. In hushed tones, they began to discuss the only option left to them, a full-scale surrender. But none of them could bring themselves to utter the words. For generations, the Galactic Council had been the unchallenged rulers of the galaxy, and the thought of giving up, of admitting defeat to the humans, was too humiliating to bear. Meanwhile, the Deathworlders continued to press on. They were relentless, unyielding, and every victory seemed to only fuel their determination. The Galactic Council was slowly being driven to the edge of total collapse, and with every new assault, the tide of war tilted further away from their favor. The death of the Council's confidence was palpable. They had built their empire on the backs of others, on their technological superiority, and their belief that they were invincible. But now, all of that was crumbling. And as the Deathworlders' fleet pressed onward, the Galactic Council knew that the future of the galaxy was no longer in their hands. The Galactic Council was on the brink of collapse. Their once dominant fleets were being shattered piece by piece, their morale plummeting, and their hopes for a swift victory had dissolved into bitter defeat. As the Deathworlders pressed their advantage, the Council leaders were left scrambling to find some way to turn the tide of the war. But what they didn't know was that the Deathworlders had anticipated this moment, and they were ready to strike again. In a hidden command center deep within the heart of the Council's most fortified capital, the High Command convened in a desperate attempt to formulate a plan. A map of the galaxy flickered on a large holoscreen, showing the locations of the Council's remaining fleets, surrounded by the vast, empty spaces of uncharted sectors where the Deathworlders had already made their mark. High Commander Kalreth, though weary and battle-worn, stood firm in the center of the room, glaring at the map. His generals, once eager to take on the Deathworlders, now exchanged uneasy glances. The time for diplomacy had passed. The time for action was now. But no one had any idea where to begin. Their forces were spread too thin, and every strategy they had attempted had been outsmarted. "Commander," one of the generals spoke up, his voice trembling. "We must consider an evacuation. The fleet is scattered. We can't win this war. They've anticipated every move we make." Kalreth's cold gaze silenced the room. He had no intention of retreating, not when the galaxy's fate was at stake. The thought of abandoning their people, of retreating into the shadows like a coward, was inconceivable. Yet, deep down, he could feel the weight of the reality creeping in. The humans didn't fight like anyone else. They didn't play by the rules, and that made them a true threat. "They've underestimated us," Kalreth muttered, Pacing slowly before the holoscreen, his mind raced, trying to come up with some new plan, anything that could offer a glimmer of hope. The Deathworlders were brutal and relentless, but they weren't invincible. The commander's mind began to shift, and the light of determination began to shine in his eyes. If they couldn't outfight the humans on their terms, they would have to draw them into a trap they could control. We need to force them into an environment they are not familiar with, Kalreth said suddenly, his voice steady. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at him. We have to take them to a place where they will have to play by our rules. One of the generals hesitated before speaking. And where do you suggest we fight them, Commander? Kalreth's eyes narrowed, and his finger traced along the coordinates of a remote region of the galaxy on the map. It was a barren, desolate stretch of space, a place where asteroids drifted freely and the gravitational pull of nearby stars created unpredictable environments. This was a region that the Deathworlders had yet to explore, an area where their usual tactics could be rendered useless. It's time we bring the battle to them. But we do it on our terms. We take them to the Black Rift. The Black Rift. It was a place known to only a few, an area of space where chaos reigned and only the most skilled could navigate through its perilous void. It was a region where the gravitational forces of nearby stars twisted space itself, creating deadly anomalies and unpredictable phenomena. For generations, the Council had studied the rift, but never dared venture into it, fearing the extreme dangers it posed to even the most advanced technology. But the Deathworlders didn't have the luxury of such knowledge. They would be like children lost in the dark, unable to anticipate the deadly traps laid before them. The Council knew that if they could bait the Deathworlders into the rift, they would have the upper hand. The Deathworlders were ruthless and brutal, but they had never fought in an environment like the Black Rift. It was the perfect place for the Council to turn the tables. The room was quiet as the Council members weighed the gravity of Kalreth's words. For the first time in what felt like forever, a sliver of hope crept into their hearts. Could they outsmart the Deathworlders? Could they force them into a battle they could control? Kalreth continued, his voice filled with conviction. We will lure them in with a false retreat. They'll think they have us cornered, that victory is within their grasp. But when they come, we will ambush them in the heart of the Black Rift. We will trap them in a place they can't escape, and then we will show them the full power of the Galactic Council. The generals exchanged looks, some still skeptical, but others saw the potential in Kalreth's plan. The Black Rift was a place of uncertainty, but it was their best shot at victory. They had to trust their commander, even if it meant taking an immense risk. I'll prepare the fleet for a feigned retreat, one of the generals said. If they follow us into the rift, we'll have one chance to make this work. With a new sense of resolve in the room, the Council's leaders began to implement Kalreth's plan. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the only hope they had left. They would have to be quick, precise, and above all, they would have to pray that the Deathworlders would fall for the trap. Meanwhile, far across the galaxy, the Deathworlders were still on the hunt. Their fleet, relentless and unforgiving, continued to advance, closing in on the last remnants of the Council's forces. But they didn't know that their greatest challenge was yet to come. The Black Rift awaited, and with it, the Council's final gambit. As the Galactic Council's fleet began its retreat toward the Black Rift, tension hung in the air like a heavy storm. The Council commanders had made their decision. They would lure the Deathworlders into this treacherous region of space and turn the tables on their relentless pursuers. Every ship, every commander, and every crew member knew the stakes were high. This was no ordinary battle. This was their last chance. The vast, well-organized fleet began to scatter across several sectors, retreating with calculated precision. At first glance, it looked like the Council was in full retreat, their once mighty forces shattered and fleeing from the inevitable. The Deathworlders, as predicted, pursued with bloodlust. They saw weakness, and they were eager to exploit it. Commander Kalreth watched from his flagship, the Imperius. His face was grim, yet his eyes betrayed a flicker of hope. They had to make the Deathworlders believe that victory was within their grasp. The fleet's movements had to be flawless, timed down to the last second. Even the smallest misstep could lead to their destruction. On the bridge of the Imperius, Kalreth stood before the tactical screen. The countdown to the ambush was near. "All ships report in," he ordered, his voice calm but firm. His officers quickly confirmed that every ship was in position, following the feigned retreat. "We're almost there, Commander," said one of his tactical officers. "The Deathworlders are closing in fast." "Hold steady," Kalreth commanded, his eyes narrowing in concentration. "Once they cross into the Black Rift, there's no turning back." The Black Rift, a vast region of unstable gravity wells, asteroids, and deadly anomalies, was now within their grasp. It had been the one place the Deathworlders had feared, an unpredictable, chaotic space where even their advanced technology would be stretched to its limits. The Council knew it had to act quickly. The Deathworlders had no idea what awaited them. And then the moment arrived. On the outskirts of the Black Rift, the Deathworlder fleet was ready to pounce. Led by Admiral Valrex, their fleet was vast, aggressive, and merciless. They had tracked the Council's movements across countless light years, and they now believed victory was assured. Admiral Valrex, his face twisted into a grin of bloodlust, issued the final order. "Advance," he commanded, his voice like gravel. The Deathworlder ships surged forward, weapons at the ready, eager to wipe out what remained of the Galactic Council's forces. They didn't know that they were walking straight into a trap. As they entered the Black Rift, the once perfect coordination of their fleet began to unravel. The rift's gravitational anomalies tugged at their ships, throwing off their formations. Their advanced navigational systems struggled to maintain control. It was exactly as Kalreth had anticipated. At the same moment, the Council fleet flipped the switch. Without warning, a massive wave of electromagnetic pulses flooded the rift, jamming the Deathworlders' communications and temporarily disabling their systems. The Deathworlder ships, now isolated and blind, had no idea what hit them. The first shots rang out from the Council ships as they emerged from hidden positions surrounding the Deathworlder fleet. The surprise attack was swift and brutal. The Deathworlders, caught off guard, scrambled to respond. But the Council had been preparing for this moment for far longer than they could have imagined. Explosions filled the void as the Council's fleet fired precisely aimed bursts of energy weapons, striking the weak points in the Deathworlders' vessels. The advantage was theirs. The once proud fleet of Deathworlders was now being torn apart, one ship at a time. Admiral Valrex's eyes widened in disbelief as his flagship, the Ravager, was struck by a concentrated burst of energy, sending it careening into a nearby asteroid. The hull buckled, and sparks flew as the ship's systems began to fail. "What in the stars is happening?" Valrex roared, scrambling to regain control of the Ravager. But it was too late. His fleet was being destroyed, caught in the gravitational chaos of the rift, while the Council ships continued their relentless assault. "Commander, we've got them," one of the Council officers shouted as the Deathworlder ships fell apart under the coordinated onslaught. "The trap has worked. They're retreating." Kalreth stood motionless, his expression unwavering. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The Deathworlders had fallen into their trap, and now they were paying the price. The Council fleet had struck hard and fast, disabling most of the Deathworlder ships before they could even mount a proper counteroffensive. But even as the first signs of victory flashed across the tactical display, Kalreth knew this battle was far from over. The Deathworlders were not just warriors. They were relentless survivors. The ambush had worked, but the war had only just taken another turn. The Deathworlders would regroup, and when they did, they would come back even stronger. Still, for now, the tide had shifted. Kalreth turned away from the tactical screen, his voice cold but resolute. "We've won this battle, but we must remain vigilant. The Deathworlders will not be so easily defeated again. The fleet of the Galactic Council had delivered a crushing blow, and for the first time in what felt like ages, hope had been rekindled. But with every victory came the knowledge that the Deathworlders would not rest until they had their revenge. As the surviving Deathworlder ships flood into the darkness of space, Kalreth's thoughts turned to the future. What would the next battle bring? Would this victory be enough to turn the tide of the war once and for all? The galaxy held its breath, knowing that the next move would define the outcome of the greatest conflict it had ever known. The aftermath of the ambush left the Galactic Council fleet in a temporary sense of triumph, but deep down, Commander Kalreth knew that this victory was only a small reprieve. The Deathworlders had been humiliated, but they were not the kind of species that would just back down after a setback. In fact, Kalreth suspected the worst. The Deathworlders would learn from their mistakes and return with even greater fury. The remnants of the Deathworlder fleet limped away from the Black Rift, their once proud ships now battered and torn. Admiral Valrex was not one to accept defeat easily. His rage, like the fury of a volcano, bubbled beneath the surface, and everyone on his ship could feel it. Set course for the nearest jump point, Valrex growled through gritted teeth. "We're not retreating. We're regrouping. The Galactic Council will pay for this humiliation." His crew exchanged uneasy glances, but they did not dare question their commander. They had learned to follow orders, no matter how brutal or reckless. It was what made them Deathworlders. Survival at any cost. Meanwhile, Kalreth's fleet remained on high alert. The ambush had been a success, but they could not afford to be complacent. The Deathworlders were known for their relentless resolve, and this war was far from over. "Commander, we've received a report from the outer sector," one of Kalreth's officers said. "It's a Deathworlder fleet, larger than we expected. They're regrouping quickly." Kalreth's heart sank. He had known this would happen, but the reality of it was still chilling. He turned to face his officers, his voice firm. "Prepare the fleet for a counteroffensive. The Deathworlders are coming back with a vengeance. We need to be ready for whatever they throw at us." The Council fleet quickly shifted into battle formation, but Kalreth couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. The Deathworlders were relentless, and their tactics were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. What they lacked in numbers, they made up for with an unmatched savagery and ingenuity in battle. Hours later, the Council fleet arrived at the outskirts of the sector where the Deathworlders had regrouped. But as Kalreth's ships dropped out of warp, they were met with a shocking sight. The Deathworlders had adapted. The once tattered Deathworlder ships were now reinforced with scavenged technology from the Council's own forces. These ships had been made stronger, faster, and deadlier. The Deathworlders had learned from their mistakes, and now they were ready to unleash their fury. "I told you," Kalreth muttered to himself. "We have underestimated them." Across the tactical display, the Deathworlder fleet advanced, their ships cutting through the darkness like predators on the hunt. They were no longer the disorganized, battered force they had been hours ago. They were a storm, and they were heading straight for the Galactic Council. "Fire at will," Kalreth barked, his voice echoing through the bridge. The first volley of energy weapons fired, lighting up the void of space like a burst of stars. But the Deathworlders were quick, their ships maneuvering with a ferocity that took the Council by surprise. They avoided the first wave of attacks and retaliated with a barrage of missiles that struck Council ships with deadly precision. "We've got breaches on the port side," one of the officers shouted. "Hull integrity is failing on multiple ships." Kalreth clenched his fists, his teeth grinding. The Deathworlders were fighting with an intensity that exceeded his expectations. Their war tactics were unlike anything he had ever witnessed, unpredictable, brutal, and shockingly effective. The battle was turning into a bloodbath. "We can't hold them off much longer, Commander," one of the officers yelled as more explosions rocked the fleet. "We need reinforcements." But there was no help coming. The Deathworlders had cut off all communications with the rest of the galaxy. The Galactic Council was alone, and they had underestimated the enemy's ability to adapt and learn. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers," Kalrith ordered. "We need to break through their lines and make a retreat." The remaining council ships scrambled to disengage, but the Deathworlders were relentless. They pursued with an unyielding rage, picking off council vessels one by one. The council fleet had been caught off guard by the speed and ferocity of the Deathworlder counterattack. The tide of war had shifted once more. And then Kalrith saw something that made his blood run cold. The flagship of the Deathworlders, the Ravager, had emerged from the smoke of the battlefield. The ship, once crippled during the ambush, was now fully operational again, its weapons bristling with deadly energy. "Valrex," Kalrith whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. Admiral Valrex had survived, and now he was ready to take his revenge. "Form a defensive perimeter," Kalrith shouted. "All ships engage the Ravager." But it was too late. The Ravager fired its main weapon, a concentrated beam of energy that tore through the heart of the Council's flagship, the Imperius. The ship shook violently as the massive beam of destruction tore through its hull, sending shockwaves across the battlefield. Kalrith gripped the railing tightly as his flagship began to break apart. The unthinkable had happened. The Deathworlders had turned the tide of the war in a matter of hours. The Galactic Council was on the brink of annihilation, and the Ravager was now hunting down the remnants of their fleet with the fury of 1,000 suns. As the darkness of space swallowed the remains of the Imperius, Kalrith's thoughts turned to one simple truth: the war was not over. The Deathworlders were only just beginning. The battle raged on, the void of space filled with the screams of dying ships and the flash of energy weapons. The Galactic Council fleet, once proud and united, was now a scattering of shattered remnants, desperately trying to escape the fury of the Deathworlders. The Ravager had proven to be a weapon of unimaginable destruction, and the Council's forces were no match for the brutal efficiency with which the Deathworlders fought. Admiral Valrex stood on the bridge of his flagship, his eyes locked onto the screen as he watched the Council ships flee, their hulls breaking apart under the weight of the relentless assault. The victory was within his grasp. He could almost taste it, the sweet taste of revenge. The Council had underestimated his people, and now they would pay the price. "Captain, prepare the Ravager for the final strike," Valrex commanded, his voice steady and cold. "Let's finish this." The crew of the Ravager sprang into action, their movements quick and precise, knowing exactly what needed to be done. The battle had been hard fought, but it was not over. The Deathworlders had survived, learned, and adapted. They had turned the tide, and now the Council was about to feel the full force of their wrath. As the Ravager powered up its main cannon, a surge of anticipation filled the air. The energy in the room seemed to vibrate with the intensity of what was about to happen. This weapon, built from the remains of a dozen different battleships, was capable of wiping out entire fleets in a single blast. Kalrith's fleet was still trying to regroup, but there was no hope for them now. The Ravager was locked onto its target. The Council had failed to understand the power of the Deathworlders, how they would rise from every setback and strike harder than before. "Target locked," Captain Vokren reported, his voice sharp with focus. "Fire." The blast from the Ravager illuminated the battlefield like a second sun. The energy beam shot forward with incredible speed, cutting through space, disintegrating anything in its path. The lead ship in Kalrith's fleet, the Zenith, didn't stand a chance. It exploded in a blaze of light, its debris scattering across the void like falling stars. The Deathworlders were unstoppable now. The Council's ships, already heavily damaged and out of position, didn't even have time to react. The Ravager continued its deadly barrage, obliterating every ship in its path. The survivors of the Galactic Council were few, scattered, and broken, desperately trying to flee into the vastness of space, but they could never outrun the Deathworlders. Kalrith watched in horror from the command deck of his ship as his fleet was systematically wiped out. His heart sank with each explosion. It had been over before he had even realized it. The Deathworlders had turned the tide of war, not with sheer numbers or superior technology, but with unrelenting tactics and a savage will to survive. "Commander," an officer shouted, panic in their voice. "We've lost communication with the rest of the fleet. We're surrounded." Kalreth's thoughts raced, but there was no escape now. The Deathworlders were closing in, their ships as terrifying as the beasts they were named after. The very air on his ship seemed to grow heavier with every passing second, the weight of defeat pressing down on them all. He had no choice but to acknowledge the truth. They were outmatched. "All ships, abandon the fight," Kalreth ordered, his voice barely a whisper. "Retreat into the deeper sectors. We'll live to fight another day." But it was too late. The Ravager had already locked on to his ship. Another shot was fired, and Kalreth's ship, the Pursuer, shook violently as the beam tore through it. Systems flickered and failed, and the crew was thrown into chaos. The Council had no choice but to flee, their hope extinguished. Outside, the Ravager loomed like a beast of nightmares, hunting down every last ship with relentless precision. Its weapons cut through space with a savage fury, and no matter how fast the Council ships tried to retreat, the Deathworlders were always one step ahead. As the last remnants of the Galactic Council fleet scattered, Kalreth's thoughts drifted back to a simple truth. The Deathworlders had shown them mercy once, but there would be no mercy now. The war was over, and the Deathworlders were victorious. In the silence of the void, as the last echoes of battle faded away, the Galactic Council knew one undeniable fact. They had underestimated the Deathworlders, and they had paid the ultimate price. The Deathworlders had won. The galaxy would remember their wrath.